Yeah. All right, great. I'd like to welcome you all on this rainy early morning at Vanderbilt and for the Global Right Turn Symposium, sort of thinking about the rise of right-wing authoritarian governments around the world in our moment. And in light of this topic, I guess my first question is, am I authorized to say that I'm utterly delighted to be here with you all? It feels like that's better than saying I'm here in a spirit of fear and dread, even though that's actually a lot more reflective of my everyday reality these days, as I think is true of many of us. As we know, the world has witnessed the rise of right-wing authoritarian movements and regimes, from Bolsonaro's Brazil to Modi's India to Orban's Hungary to Trump's America. And for those who value democracy, freedom, social justice, and sustainable life on planet Earth, there's a great deal to be alarmed about here as citizens, political actors, and as human beings. And we're here today to summon our skills as historians and scholars to make sense of this reality as much as we can. And to kind of bring the kind of skills of inquiry, of critical insight to this reality. Asking ourselves questions like, what histories, what longer realities do these movements and regimes grow out of? And what are their causes, both their immediate causes and their more seemingly distant causes? Asking these and other kinds of questions allows us to push back on two important discursive tendencies. One, I think, is to anomalize and to exceptionalize these developments, right? To say that in our various contexts, this is a fluke, this is sort of an anomaly. In the phrase that we're often hearing in the United States, this is not who we are, right? The term unprecedented gets used a lot, frequently, and while it's often factually accurate in some sense, it also conveys a broader and ultimately comforting sense that these movements come from nowhere and perhaps lacking deep roots are a kind of passing historical development. Importantly, though, if asking these kinds of questions about history allow us to push back against that sense of their shallowness and their exceptionality, it also allows us to push back against the sense that they're inevitable. That's a kind of perspective that is advanced by many of these movements themselves, right? The sense that the emergence of this kind of authoritarian politics is somehow imminent in historical development itself and therefore not capable of being challenged. Historical perspectives allows us to discuss the very contingencies in making them possible and therefore kind of unseating the possibilities of their being inevitable. In critically historicizing these movements and regimes today, we're necessarily going to be doing this from a variety of interpretive and political perspectives. And that's as it should be. In a way, we can think about that very interpretive pluralism as a form of defiance in the form of movements that would deny that very pluralism and the spaces that make it possible. 4 points that are likely to surface, or I suspect may surface in and out of our conversations, that I'll go over briefly. One is questions of terminology. Some very basic questions about how we conceptualize these realities. And there's a whole host of terms that get used, sometimes interchangeably, sometimes casually and imprecisely. Populism, authoritarianism, which I've been using, racial or ethnic nationalism, and there are many others. And it occurs to me that we might want to think about what's at stake in these designations, which are often used, again, without a lot of sort of explicit precision. What aspects of these phenomena do specific terms shed light on, and which aspects do they obscure intentionally or inadvertently? In other words, we're called upon to some extent to think about these terms' own political, cultural, and intellectual history, and then looking at how we enlist them ourselves. A second question is, what is the relationship between these movements and regimes and the crisis-prone unleashing of capitalist power relations across societies, a process carried out by many of its architects and often by many of its commentators under the rubric of neoliberalism? It's clearly too easy to identify the relationship as one of cause and effect, but it's also undeniable that these movements derive, at least in part and perhaps in large measure, from realities of social immiseration tied closely to the withdrawal of many states' guarantees of social and economic citizenship and participation in the name of global competition and the so-called free market. To what extent are these movements core promises of the securitizing of society against the conjured threats of migrants, racial and religious others, assertive women, and claims-making LGBTQ people, a kind of complex hegemonic substitute for earlier promises to protect society from the vagaries and disciplines of the market? Third, how do these movements grow out of older and durable politics of social differentiation, especially in terms of race, gender, and sexuality? In the immediate aftermath of the 2016 presidential election, for example, in the US, an enormous amount of ink was spilled over the question of whether the election of Donald Trump was due to, quote, race or to economics, right? Was this about economic anxiety or racial resentment, et cetera? And to me, this struck me as an incredibly artificial separation of factors that needed to be tightly braided together, precisely because of the way they were so tightly braided together in history. We can ask ourselves how the structures of 20th century politics, including the national welfare state itself, contributed to hierarchies of identification, privilege, and entitlement of social insiders and outsiders that have been mobilized and weaponized for hegemonic purposes. And in what ways do the particular contours of the present-day crisis call upon us to explore the many ways that modern democratic states, historically and ongoing, have relationships to imperial power and to unfree productive and reproductive labor? And fourth, and this gets explicitly to the kind of global dimensions, is to ask ourselves to what extent this really represents a transnational or global phenomenon and what it would mean to say that it was. This isn't to say that these represent a kind of coherent or unified movement. There are ways that they could be triggered by a common global phenomenon, ramifying in ways that are similar and recognizable, but also ultimately separable, right? And I think we have to maintain the significance of kind of local and regional factors and historical developments in making these movements, as well as we acknowledge the global and transnational dimensions. But alongside being triggered perhaps by global phenomena, we can also look at connections and interactions. One regime hailing another in the effort to provide mutual support and legitimacy through a kind of rightist international. And I think we see that developing at both the movement level and the regime level, as kind of one movement will hail another, effacing differences and trying to bring to the surface similarities in order to create a sense of global legitimacy. Arguably, all political argument is embedded, for better or for worse, in a sense of time and historical time, how things change, and therefore of what can change and what can't change. And for that reason, I'd suggest that the way we talk about history, the way we talk about what can change over time and how, has enormous political implications. And as Joan Scott and others have reminded us, the task of critical history is to do the hard work of continually opening and reopening possibilities for the future, often against very formidable obstacles, and at dark moments when the sparks of those very futures appear to be in jeopardy. And for that enterprise, we need all of our knowledge, wit, and insight here together. Okay, before we embark with our first panel, I'd like to just thank the many sponsors of this event. This event's been co-sponsored by the Global History Seminar and the History Department, by the Office of Research in Vanderbilt's Arts and Sciences School, the History Department, the Program in Asian Studies, the Max Kade Center, American Studies, and Latin American Studies. And I'd like to especially thank Heidi Welch, Susan Hildebrand, Lisa Hawkins, and especially Philip Hauser for all their hard work in making today's event possible. In terms of how we're going to proceed, so we have 3 panels. Each speaker will have about a half hour, and after each pair of 2, we'll hopefully have about a half hour of dialogue. We'll take a coffee break after the first panel, lunch after the second panel. I'm trying to build in a lot of breaks here because these are difficult topics. We may need some harder beverages at some point. And then we're going to resume in the afternoon with a comment, and then hopefully have some more time for dialogue in the afternoon. We'll plan on finishing up our deliberations around 3, after which we'll have an informal reception here. And we realize that we have a lot going on and that people are busy, so feel free to come and go between speakers if you need to. We're glad you're here for as much time as you can commit to our dialogue together. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first panel, Philip Terr and Sean Jacobs. So Philip Terr is a global distinguished professor at NYU's Center for European and Mediterranean Studies during fall of 2018, and a visiting fellow at NYU's Remark Institute during spring 2019. He's a professor of Central European History at the University of Vienna, where he also served as director of the Institute of East European History from 2014 to 2018. He's published on a wide variety of themes, from the history of opera in Central Europe in the 19th century to the history of Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall in the book Europe Since 1989, A History. He's written on the history of ethnic cleansing in The Dark Side of Nation States, Ethnic Cleansing in Modern Europe, and in a recently published work, soon to be published in English by Princeton, as The Outsiders on Refugees in European History Across the Longue Durée. So we'll start with Philip, and after his talk, we'll introduce Sean and go from there.
Okay, thanks a lot for organizing this, putting it together, for the invitation, and I'm really glad to be here and to be in contact with all of you. I think that's really exciting. Now, I know this is, there's a video, and well, there's a certain contradiction to what I'm doing to videotaping. I'm giving more or less a free speech based on some notes, and there's always, the disadvantage of this more open format. It helps the discussion. Of course, it's less concise than reading. But anyway, I'll try my best, also not in my native language. The basic question, which is sometimes tormenting me, is how we came from the so-called Annus Mirabilis, 1989, to the what I would term the Annus Horribilis, 2016, which ended, of course, also in a very bad way in Italy. So, but anyway, what went wrong? And I'm interested in that intellectually, as a historian, but also as a formerly active 89er. Now, you have outlined really productive questions about populism. We also are, I would say, confronted as historians with a flurry of political science literature, more being published than sometimes I can read, or I want to read. And so the question is, how can we as historians contribute to that debate? I think the basic problem is that we see confronted with the seemingly same or similar result: populism on the rise everywhere. Well, but first of all, the degree of that rise is very different. Contained in some countries, in other countries already, in power, and that is one thing. But the other thing is, even so the result might look similar, I think it is based on very different preconditions and contexts, and therefore I suspect that we have very different causes. And I think this is why a deeper historical perspective is needed, also a timeline, in order to maybe arrive at a more, variegated causal explanation. I will structure the talk today as follows: a brief excursion into the history of Central Europe after '89, because I was, after all, supposed to speak about Central Europe according to the title. Of course, pertaining to populism and the prehistory of it, or already the full-fledged history, I would argue. Second, some considerations about causal explanation with reference to Kai Polanyi. And then three, the relationship between populism and nationalism. So in this way, I would like to contribute to a terminological debate with not a real set result. Nevertheless, I think it's good to think about it as you made me think about it with your call for papers. Now, one, the short excursion into the past. I will now put on the stopwatch here. I want to enter basically in the middle of the timeline between '89 and 2016, which we could term an age of transformation. When Carsten Mudde, the Dutch political scientist, wrote his famous article, The Populist Zeitgeist. I'll leave alone the Zeitgeist as a category here. Obviously, populism was already there. That's what he referred to. And then, you get all the various examples. FPÖ in my country of residence and second citizenship. Le Pen was the Lega Nord. We might also argue that at that time already we had the first populist politician in power, Silvio Berlusconi. And I had the great luck to live in Italy between 2007 and 2010, so I enjoyed it all. Now, at the same time, the very early millennium, you also see the EU presenting the Lisbon strategy, carved out by experts and in view of the upcoming Eastern enlargement. And there the EU presented itself as kind of a bulwark of reforms and of what I would call technocratic governance. I mean, there were some social modifications, so I wouldn't condemn it as a clearly neoliberal strategy. I didn't do that in my Europe since '89 book. But nevertheless, I think there's already then this dialectics, between the supranational institution, the EU, and then the first rise of populists. Already then, populism was stronger in Eastern Europe. And here I would like to refer to Poland. Parliamentary elections 2001. There were 3 parties getting into parliament, basically all of them new, but not entirely, of course, but Samo-Obrona, this was kind of an agrarian left populist movement. The Liga Polskich Rodzin, but this was kind of right-wing, far-right to a degree. And then the people governing now, Prawa i Sprawiedliwość, so peace. And they gathered together almost 30% of the vote. The turnout was 46%. Interestingly enough, nobody talked about a crisis of democracy then. This is what is kind of fascinating for me in this debate about populism. Often you have the feeling when you read all the publications as if it had come out of nowhere. But there were warnings against it already in the 90s. Then of course Mude and others published about it early on, and we see it happening earlier. The election was won by the post-communists with more than 40%, the biggest victory ever, with a partially populist agenda as well. That leads me to my first major point, or conclusion. I think it is sometimes not easy and underestimated to distinguish intellectually sound between mainstream and populist parties. And I believe the reactions of the mainstream parties to so-called populism are as important as the agenda of the so-called populists. And much of it is an issue of political branding, and there, of course, one should, pay attention who is doing it and for which purposes. Back to Poland. This vote in 2001, almost 30%. It was mostly a protest of the so-called transformation losers. The biggest share of votes was in what was termed Polska B, so eastern, northern, underdeveloped part of the country, more than half of the country. And what did they protest against? Against the previous neoliberal government with its free market agenda. Leszek Balcerowicz, the father of the Polish reforms in '89, who crafted what I would term the Warsaw Consensus in parallel to the Washington Consensus, he was the finance minister, and his recipe for more growth and more development and also joining the European Union was, again, austerity, like in '89, the continuation of the privatizations, which in the mid-'90s had been slowed down, also by the post-communists. However, like in '89-'90, he was confronted with rising unemployment, partially due to these privatizations. Finally, free market capitalism and the priority of profit in corporations arrived with a much stronger degree than before. Which, by the way, the late '90s, if you look at the impact of the real social impact, the social history of the transformation, or if you want, neoliberalism, then the late '90s are as important as the early '90s when all the reform programs were crafted. But anyway, this unemployment, I wouldn't blame Balcerowicz. There's this fashion of scapegoating Balcerowicz for everything, which I think is plainly wrong. He's an honest man. Part of it was also due to demographic reasons. After the declaration of martial law in Poland in 1981, there was a big baby boom. Well, you guess why, if you live in the States and are confronted with baby statistics after electric power cuts, and they had often power cuts. But anyway, this was, the post-Solidarność, the martial law baby boom. And eventually, I would say the problem was solved if we want to talk about, solutions in this way by entering the European Union. And so the added, or well, how can we say, this unemployment and too much offering of labor power was capped by the possibility to emigrate to other EU countries. Sweden, the UK, which opened up right away, but also, there were possibilities to go to Germany, Austria, and so on. And that, took the brunt of this social problem, with, of course, a lot of bad effects on the society remaining. By the way, one comment about populism. I mean, without, the people having left, if they had been still there, the same is true for East Germany, and for, basically all of post-communist Europe. If you factor in the people who left, who very often were agile, fairly young, had seen part of the world, had traveled, would they still be there and all vote? The situation would look very different. And there's this misunderstanding all around, with this juxtaposition. Here is the, the metropolises, the liberal urban upper crust, and here's, agraria, the I don't know, rural, maybe even Tennessee, whatever. I mean, look who is left, and look who is left, and look who is left behind. That's also a factor. Anyway, but I would say in this 2001, and in many other of these Eastern European elections, including East German, we could regard populism as a form of protest against, if you want to design them as such, neoliberal or laissez-faire economic policies. And how can we theorize it? How can it be better understood? Here I want to refer the first time to Polanyi, who coined this term double movement. I will come back to that, but basically, okay, if there's too much laissez-faire, then this provokes societal protests. A short reference to Italy in 2013. Now there's a numerical similarity. After the so-called Euro crisis, okay, and another, austerity program combined with some, attempts to liberalize the labor market and pension reform, you have another one of those protest votes with, incredibly similar results to Poland in 2001. Almost 26% for the Five Star Movement, 4% for the then still weak Lega Nord, and only 10% for the centrists around the technocrat Mario Monti. So again, a populist vote in protest against austerity and what was perceived as neoliberal. Now, of course, Italy, is very different from Poland. There's more of a welfare state, also again a weak one. So, one would have to consider all that and, time, context. Anyway, again, you could have this kind of more spontaneous protest in the disguise of populism. At least northern Italy, structurally, I would say this is could be considered a part of Central Europe in terms of, a rather late industrialization, other comparabilities. Why did I also take Italy? Because to point to the fact that Central Europe, and even if you take post-communist Europe and juxtapose, let's say, Poland and the Czech Republic, internally it is very diverse. Leading back to my previous conclusions, there must be different causes if you have so different preconditions. To back that up, I would also point to example of Austria and often overlooked Switzerland, which also had very strong populist parties rising since a long time. Also, both countries have strong welfare states. So again, must be different causes. By the way, in causal explanations, very often you see the blame being put on the refugee crisis and the general issue of migration. Now, I would agree that the left is not handling migration in a very ingenious way, and so this issue could be taken over by the right. Nevertheless, all these populists, this is why I had this excursion, they were already on the rise after the turn of the millennium, and of course also after the big crisis about which Adam Tooze has written so an ingenious book. So, it happened obviously before, so the influx of those refugees, yes, it was an added factor, maybe important, but it is not the root cause. Okay, I've mentioned causes a couple of times, so now my attempt of a causal explanation, at least for the sake of our discussion. At the moment, I'm interested in that myself because I'm writing a kind of a collection of essays on the transformation after '89 and why history ended so differently than predicted. And of course, it was not just Fukuyama, it was also Jeffrey Sachs and other people, double transition, you have it all around. Well, I tried to find, ideas in existing literature and came up to read Polanyi again. So what I'm saying is partially based on him. He is used in this research field varieties of capitalism, so maybe what I'm doing is not very original at all, but nevertheless, for historians, it might offer something new. The first term I would like to come back to is this double movement. So Polanyi claims in his book, The Great Transformation, published in 1944, that too much laissez-faire capitalism and social dislocation provoke counter-reaction, a desire for what he terms social protection. So what are we witnessing now? Is it just a pendulum move, right? From, if we would term it as such, from neoliberalism to illiberalism? I think there's certain empirical backup to that, and that is the relative strength of right-wing populists in what Polanyi already termed the free market societies. The populists scored their biggest victories in Hungary, a country ravaged by the global crisis and the specific East European bubble and subsequent crisis. Poland, which was not hit that much by the crisis, but however, with a liberal government until it lost the election in 2015, even the government issued so-called trash contracts, Schmidt-Sówki, that's what they're called in Polish. So even the government was creating precarious conditions of employment. So a whole society basically was left in too much insecurity, I would argue. Then, that is 2015 when they won there. The UK, Brexit, okay. Well, what could one say about the UK? The protracted economic crisis, coinciding with the large-scale immigration at the wrong time, if you want, and then, of course, combined with a post-imperial identity crisis. Finally, the US, I won't say anything about it because Adam Tooze has laid it all out in his book, Crashed. Back to social protection, another Polanyian keyword. And if you look at the populist party programs, we can see that they're full of protectionist promises. So the promise to ward off international competition, hence they're against free trade and for economic protectionism. They promise to protect the domestic labor market, so hence against labor migrants and above all refugees. Now here, xenophobia is a hallmark of the right-wing populists, right? This shouldn't be mingled too much. So, for example, Yellow Vest so far, no anti-immigration agenda yet. So, I don't want to put everything in the box, but nevertheless, okay. Against competition at the national labor market, then the promise to safeguard internal safety, to fight against crime, and last but not least, to preserve national values and traditional family values. So there is a strong gender dimension in that. Obviously, this hooks up with Polanyi's idea of social protection. And there seems to be a need of that, and that's what the populists respond to. Polanyi has another idea in his great work, the memory of social dislocation. He argues that past misery is memorized. People don't forget it when they once were unemployed, left their houses, whatever might happen to them. So even if they rise again, if they have to, a good new job, better incomes, the fear of social dislocation or downgrading remains among them. Now this is difficult to research also for us as historians, even more difficult. Nevertheless, I think it is a very important thought to understand why people vote for right-wing populists in countries which are not poor and which are doing relatively well in the globalization. So Austria, also if you look at southern Germany, where the populists scored also pretty well, I think it has to do with that people who once experienced unemployment or the possibility of social downgrading, they are afraid that it might happen again, and therefore fall prey to these protectionist promises, or fall prey sounds so making them like passives. They make their choice. We also would have more purely traditional economic factors. That would be the slow recovery from the global crisis in the Rust Belt states, in post-industrial England, in this country certainly also in the States, which were more affected by the real estate bubble. Additionally to that, even in rich countries, Austria and Germany, it is known that the lower middle class has at best stagnating incomes in the past 10, 15, 20 years. Situation looks worse in Italy. And then there's a general disorientation and anxiety about the accelerated economic changes in the past 30 years. So basically about globalization, which as a historian I would use with great care, and its small-scale version, European integration. By and large, however, one could argue that, against the social dislocation and degradation, the welfare states did better, and they also now resist the rise of populism better. You don't have the same victories for them. Of course, it also is correlated with political systems, binary, two-party system, parliamentary, there's a lot of other factors. Now coming back to those welfare states, okay, the more social protection also meant, I would say, more protection from the populist lure. However, there's something which sometimes is termed welfare state chauvinism, and which I would rather term as the welfarist moral economy. The lower middle class is well aware that the welfare state protects it from social disruption and offers chances like free schooling, free universities, and so on. Now, the old welfare state was based on entitlements. Okay, you paid in your social security, and then you're entitled to receive this and that. The reformed welfare state, the change is especially obvious in Germany and Austria, is more oriented on neediness. Okay, you get something if you fall under a certain level of property income, etc. Now this was already disruptive in certain ways. Also, it doesn't necessarily mean that the welfare recipients receive less money, but the basis is different. The result which it has is that protracted unemployment meant impoverishment, or a much higher risk of impoverishment. And I think now, the migration issue and the refugee issue comes in. The welfare for migrants and post-migrants, second, third generation, for example, of guest workers, and the refugees, creates more competition for the remaining benefits. Now, this sounds like maybe an abstract thesis, a Marxist construction. Why and how would they compete? But I think there's even a daily life or everyday experience of that competition to be felt, for example, in unemployment offices and in the public health system. You're confronted with post-migrants and migrants all the time. And there is a competition, if you sit in the emergency room at the local hospital and half of the crowd is coming from abroad. And I think that creates tensions. This, I would say, anthropologically based experience of competition. There might be a task for historians to research that and also to measure that, to be precise and to back it up with empirical findings. There's also a competition for low-skilled jobs on the labor market. And I think this is why migrants, in particular refugees, are perceived as competitors and sometimes even as a threat. And their equal treatment by the welfare state is often perceived as something like a line jumping. This is what I call the moral economy, the welfarist moral economy. Of course, the term from E.P. Thompson. And there it goes like, okay, we, the insiders, so to say, we paid years of contributions. And now they, who have recently arrived, receive the benefits having contributed nothing. Yeah. And I think this is the moral economy of the lower, at times, welfare-dependent middle class. Summing all this up in the terms of a causal explanation, I would argue that I would stress medium-term social and long-term socio-economic factors, which then received an additional push through the short-term factor of the refugee crisis in Germany and Austria, and in the US and UK through the already longer issue of labor migration. But one could also find counter-arguments about that. Second conclusion, if you are for a globalized liberal or neoliberal world order, you need a strong welfare state as a counterbalance, in spite of what I just said about the roots of the backlash in the welfare state. Nevertheless, this is maybe one of the surprising results of Reaganomics or Thatcherism and what we have seen after the Washington Consensus after '89. When all the free marketeers and proponents of globalization argued for laissez-faire capitalism and for cutting back the state, cutting big government, I think they were wrong. And according to their ideas, had they but wrong in a surprising way. If they wanted to have create backup for their ideas and democratic majorities, then they should have thought about welfarist securitization. They should have maybe also read Polanyi, but he's difficult to read. Okay, now coming to point 3, and I only have 6 minutes left. The relationship between populism and nationalism, and maybe some ideas about the terminological debate. Now, if you read populism and then all the nationalist demands, be it the wall in southern Hungary or the wannabe wall in this country at the Mexican border, And if I see populism there, then that presupposes two things. That first of all, the people in power are cynics, right? They're just proposing all the walls and all the other nationalist ideas out of cynicism to win majorities. And second, there's a second hidden assumption there, that these, radical nationalist proposals are indeed popular and shared by a majority of the population. And I'm not so sure about that. Even here in this country, I wouldn't be sure about even the Republican base, at least not all of it. Nevertheless, we can see that all these nationalist demands are pivotal and defining populism. Why is that? All the protectionist promises I mentioned before are built upon insider, outsider, us against them distinctions. So they make sense. According to Benedict Anderson and his model of nationalism, contact with foreigners and foreign cultures led to the rise of modern nationalism. And maybe that is what happened, right? Increasing confrontation with migrants of all kinds led to increasing awareness of their own nationhood, but also to nationalism in the sense of an ethnic nationalism. This is opposed, of course, to the, we can say, postmodern hope and theory that multiculturalism, right, the intercultural encounters lead to more tolerance. Maybe both of these conflicting models are true depending on the economic, social, and cultural resources of the involved groups. Being the ones who are already there, the insiders, and the people arriving, the outsiders. Nevertheless, we see this tension, and I think this could be easily exploited by the populists, by the right-wing populists. And that's what they have done all the past 30 years. Now, initially they have done that as populists in opposition. And now we're confronted, since a number of years, with populists in government. I think they should be more strictly distinguished. I mean, we also do the nationalism studies. That's why I refer to Benedict Anderson. Is the nationalism against or is it with the state? That's a key distinction. So when populists are in power in governing countries or co-governing it, the ethno-nationalism is propagated from above, and it can be institutionalized, as in Hungary and other countries. There's another mechanism, I think, which is important, which I would call the self-radicalization of right-wing populists and nationalists, okay? I'll use there a plus. First, a peer group mechanism. The radicals have a higher profile and they move up in these administrations. I mean, look who has left the Trump administration and who is still in. I think over time, if populist politicians, even if we presuppose that they're cynics, if they repeat this nationalist propaganda 10, 20, 100 times, over the time they're going to believe it. I think by now somebody like Orban probably really believes that Soros is a global menace. And the third factor, populism, or this kind of populist governance, results in increasing national, internal, societal, and international tension with national minorities, with international partners and competitors. And the increasing conflicts confirm the pre-existing nationalism. So again, that leads to the radicalization of right-wing populists being in power. So my summary now, because the 30 minutes are over, because of that, I think it is, well, we don't want to be determinist, but what we have seen in history, I think already now, is this radicalization of right-wing populists, them becoming right-wing nationalists. And that is my conclusion for today.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our second speaker on this panel is Sean Jacobs. He's Associate Professor of International Affairs at the New School and a scholar of media and international affairs. He's worked as a political analyst at the Institute for Democracy in South Africa in Cape Town, and as a journalist, and has held fellowships at Harvard University, New York University, and the New School for Social Research, and he's a Ford Foundation Africa No Filter Fellow. He's contributed articles to The Nation, The Guardian, Mail and Guardian, and The National, and is the founder and editor of the website Africa is a Country, a site of criticism and analysis. His current book, Media in Post-Apartheid South Africa, Post-Colonial Politics in the Age of Globalization, will be out May Day 2019, so just over a month.
Okay. So thanks for inviting me, Paul. So first, I just have to give a disclaimer. I'm actually not, I saw in the program that I'm listed as a historian. I don't know how I should take that, whether I should take it as a compliment or whether I should view it with dread. I was trained as a political scientist, a fraternity of which I'm now a lapsed member. And before my academic career, I worked in a democracy think tank in South Africa. So what I'm going to say is mostly kind of drawing on that kind of experience. I hope my observations are useful to the larger discussion about the global right turn, especially to arrive at some general conclusions or insights. Having said that, let me speak specifically to the African experience. And I have to also say at the outset that for me, this kind of global right turn is also kind of like a moving target, particularly because I'm going to say something which I think is an obvious link to the sort of right-wing populism globally, and at the same time I kind of want to stretch the how we think about this by including sort of examples which don't make direct linkages to like the way in which we think like white nationalism or sort of racial politics. And then also finally, it is interesting that I'm speaking from the experience of having lived under what was a white nationalist populist regime that governed for at least 40 years. When they weren't a minority, but governed through a sort of a form of authoritarianism and an electoral regime for white South Africans. So I want to make a series of observations which I hope will add up to something useful, and will use the end of my remarks, I just want to put my timer on, to respond to some of the questions hinted at by Paul in a note he sent around to the speakers and which is printed on the posters. I'm just going to time myself. I want to make sure that I keep to the times. Here we go. Okay. So the first and obvious connection we can make to the global right in Africa is, of course, to South Africa, the country on the continent with a visible and powerful white minority. South Africa matters for the global right in two respects. One, as a projection of the global right, i.e. the nostalgia for apartheid and the nightmare of being ruled by blacks. And secondly, it reinvigorates a strain of white South African politics, i.e. the reactionary victim politics of disaffected whites there. For me, the fates of these two movements are mutually reinforcing and contributes to its transnational claims, though I'd venture that the former gets more out of it than the latter. In terms of projection, this is of course a longer history dating back to the early part of the 20th century. And it is one that over time doesn't just implicate right-wing fringe groups like segregationists in the US or Europe, the likes of the John Birch Society or ex-colonials, but also governments. In 1980, Chester Crocker, the highest-ranking Reagan administration official on matters African, put it bluntly about his new boss, and I quote, "All Reagan knows about Southern Africa is that he is on the side of the whites," unquote. The glue, apart from racism for the Americans, was also anti-communism and favoring free markets, which was deemed the province of whites. So in crude ways, South Africa was the white nightmare, frightened whites encircled by murderous black, capitalism menaced by communism. As we know, South Africa outlawed apartheid and negotiated democratic rule, that is liberal democracy. And in 1994, its people gained their political freedom. Which is where I want to pick up the other side of the story, the reconfiguration post-apartheid of the white right in South Africa. And if you can indulge me just to say a little bit of detail about that. To go back to apartheid, apartheid, if it was a racist colonial project, was also an ethno-nationalist project. It was also a kind of affirmative action for whites. It set up banks, mutual aid societies, a land bank, insurance companies for its primary beneficiaries, Afrikaners. So the end of apartheid didn't just represent fear, but anger at lost affirmation of Afrikaners and whites in general, rights to be guaranteed preferential treatment, and the dread that they might lose their privileges even though they haven't to any great extent. In South Africa, the post-apartheid consensus is a liberal one, generally referred to as rainbowism. So right-wing politics, victim politics, initially had little organized political expression, even if it did have widespread sentiment among whites. The National Party, the party which governed South Africa from 1948 to 1994, and introduced apartheid and instituted those affirmative action programs, faded away, and the majority of white voters shifted their votes to a party, the Democratic Alliance, which identifies as liberal. The party recently got a black leader and gets roughly 20% of the national vote, which means it has some black support as well, since some whites support the ANC, which is the ruling party in South Africa, the party of Nelson Mandela, or other parties, and whites as a whole make up less than 10% of the population. A quick note on this Democratic Alliance, this Liberal Party, is important. The Democratic Party is ideologically similar to the US Republican Party or the UK's Conservative Party, so basically kind of center-right. The DA has had some difficulty, however, in silencing the more right-wing among its leaders. For example, Helen Zille, the previous party leader, is a white politician who serves as premier of one of the provinces, the one province that the DA governs. She has become infamous for her offensive tweets and rationalizations about the supposed benefits of colonialism or her praise of Donald Trump. The DA has reached its ceiling with white voters and want to branch out to more black support, but the new direction has a danger of alienating some of the party's more conservative white voters. It is they who are open to this kind of this right-wing turn in South African politics, this kind of long right-wing turn which seems to come back in cycles. This even more extreme right-wing under apartheid was in both a tense and mutually beneficial relationship with mainstream white politics. The National Party could use it as a bogey as to why it wasn't reforming apartheid fast enough, that it had to placate their demands and fears. It originated mainly among white mine and industrial skilled workers who owed their position and ranks to as I referred to already, the racial affirmative action politics of apartheid. They were mainly organized in the trade union Solidariteit, which translates as solidarity, and it took its name actually from the Polish solidarity movement. After the end of apartheid, the union's leadership sought to modernize and even opened up its membership to other races. But it was clear that the welfare of Afrikaners was its primary business. Crucially, and this is where the link comes back to this kind of moment that we're experiencing now with the global right, the trade union also started a civil society wing, which is called AfriForum, which kind of means like Afrikaner Forum, complete with welfare and lobbying services. Over time, AfriForum's work took precedent and received the most media attention, and it seemed achieved the most results. AfriForum's leadership made two issues their flagship campaigns: affirmative action, as it now negatively affected whites, and crime and farm murders. On the first, they used the courts to sue companies and the state, so they're kind of operating within the framework of democratic politics. And they had some success with this. However, AfriForum would get more traction for its work on crime and the related attacks on farmers. Now, South Africa has a high crime rate that disproportionately affects poor black people living in township, but AfriForum singled out crime mainly as it affected whites. It soon began to repeat unfounded claims that were circulating among other right-wing groups, particularly online. During protest marches and in media appearances, its leaders made the explosive claim that the South African government was coordinating attacks on white farmers, what they called a genocide. Now, there is no evidence for this, as it's confirmed by fact-checking organizations and by the police. Nevertheless, the claim persists, and it took on a life of its own online. Not surprisingly, AfriForum's leaders found traction for their claims about a genocide against white farmers among US, Canadian, and European right-wing activists online. Their claims soon circulated on outlets like Breitbart, The Alex Jones Show, and Rebel Media in Canada. Right-wing personalities began to travel to South Africa and make documentaries about the plight of farmers, including filming people arming themselves, and related documenting white poverty. And this is sort of a separate thing which I don't have the time, and I'll just confuse people more. But white poverty in South Africa sort of averages out between like 1% and 5%. And there's been an increase in like say 1 or 2 or 3 squatter camps next to some of the major cities in South Africa. But this is sort of being, if you Google now the words white poverty, often what will first come up is white people living in sacks and this in slums, and this kind of feeds this kind of politics. And I just also have to say, again, this is not something new, because white poverty as a problem in South Africa is also a very long concern in the West. So going back to what I said earlier about South Africa as projection, in the 1930s, for example, as early as the 1930s, the Carnegie Corporation funded a large study in what was called the poor white problem, which dovetailed really well with what white Afrikaner nationalists were arguing at that point, what was their agenda in their fight to begin to control the state. Early on, AfriForum's leaders, along with other far-right leaders, prioritized the need to gain international sympathy for their struggles. From the early 2000s onward, many of these agreed to be interviewed or profiled on right-wing blogs of mostly European right-wing groups in Sweden, Britain, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Some of them even traveled there, getting their plight registered on the parliamentary record. For example, in Belgium, like Vlaamse Blok, which is Flemish Bloc, they actually visited the parliament, and they actually put forward a resolution on this. They've met with Marine Le Pen in France, etc. I think it's called the IFB in Germany, and so on. In May 2018, though, 2 of AfriForum's leaders traveled to the US, and this was kind of their big prize on the first leg of what they called an international campaign to protest against land reform in South Africa. There they scored a major public relations coup. They met with officials from USAID, which is the United States sort of aid agency, with the office of Senator Ted Cruz. They happened to run into John Bolton, the National Security Advisor to Trump, and took a selfie with him, and it became viral. They met with conservative think tanks, the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute, and again, going back to this long projection, organizations that during apartheid had echoed the South African government's talking points and opposed campaigns for disinvestment and trade sanctions against apartheid. AfriForum's biggest coup of the trip, however, was an interview with Tucker Carlson on Fox News in a segment, you can see where this is going, in a segment posted online with the title, quote, "White farmers are being brutally murdered in South Africa for their land, and no one is brave enough to talk about it," unquote. In August last year, months after the interview, President Donald Trump, responding to a Tucker Carlson story about land reform in South Africa, tweeted that he would direct the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to, quote, "closely study the South African land and farm seizures and expropriations and the large-scale killings of farmers," unquote. As Michael Bucher, a Canadian sociologist studying transnational solidarity movements among the right, has suggested, in doing so, that Trump mainstreamed the racist conspiracy theories that had been propagated by white nationalists in South Africa and their international supporters. Not surprisingly, the far right in South Africa and around the world was jubilant. Now, it's worth noting that AfriForum was roundly condemned by representatives of all major political parties and media in South Africa. Nevertheless, Trump's tweets, and by implication validation of their genocide claims, had upped their profile among right-wingers in South Africa and globally. For now, they don't hold office, nor are they participating in elections. Nevertheless, the ideas are being mainstreamed in some quarters of the Afrikaans media and in that Liberal Party, the Democratic Alliance, among some of its members, and are legitimated, and they are legitimized as spokespeople whenever the media needs a comment for a story about Afrikaners. It's also interesting that latest poll numbers and results of recent by-elections shows that a party close to AfriForum, which has sort of similar politics but is represented in parliament, is taking votes away from that Democratic Alliance, the Liberal Party I mentioned earlier. Which brings me to my second comment. So I'm going to sort of like move away from what I think is kind of that obvious link that people make to South Africa, and I want to emphasize that it's way more projection rather than because this, whites make up 10% of the population. There are some, and if people are interested, I could talk about how there are other black, mostly black groups making ethno-nationalist claims that find traction among what AfriForum is saying, and so that they are in alliances. The Zulu King, for example, has an alliance with AfriForum. There are other groups who claim First Nation status, in which they construct, they almost invent a kind of identity about their claim to the land, that they were there first, and AfriForum also champions that kind of politics, and so, but again, that's going off into too much detail. So my second point, the second set of points I want to make is what I was referring to when I said at the outset. There's also a way in which there are politics on the African continent which may not seem obvious to kind of align with this kind of new right politics, because it doesn't have the racial or racist, what we might identify as kind of a racist element to it. So in a way, I'm sort of changing tack here. So while it's true that Trump's agenda of stoking racial animosity and anti-immigration politics, anti-immigrant policies, is at odds with the politics of most black Africans, there are some ways in which Trump and the kind of politics that he's representing is admired. In some countries, it is for his supposed success as a businessman, traits that many feel are needed in government, and I'll sort of explain that in a minute. But more than this is the growth of anti-immigrant and anti-refugee politics. Like most, and Africa is not immune to xenophobia and xenophobic politics. Think of recent incidents of Ghanaian attitudes hardening towards Nigerians in Ghana. Then there's, of course, in South Africa, where since the end of apartheid, there have been a series of pogroms against other Africans from countries north of South Africa, migrants and refugees. Just yesterday, there were reports from South Africa of foreign nationals in Durban, the largest city on the country's northeast coast, fleeing their homes and hiding in a police station and a local mosque. For our purposes, what is interesting is that xenophobia is widespread among elected officials and also within the media, and the media also complicit in the way that they report these opinions and report about xenophobia and immigration and refugees. All political parties in South Africa try to mobilize voters based on theirs and voters' xenophobia. Which brings me to a third point, and this is an example of those elements of global right-wing politics that are less obvious, as I said, since they don't line up with the white nationalist or racist components of the movement. And here I'm talking about the way that neoliberalism and authoritarianism is combined as a political model in many of these African countries. Basically what some people call neoliberal authoritarianism. Let me track back for a bit. Democratization in Africa dates back to the early 1990s, in the wake of the end of the Cold War, so like the post-89, there was kind of this whole period of a series of political transitions that resulted in the balance of African countries by the late 1990s opting for liberal democracy. Liberal democracy, predictably, as Philip said, did not solve the economic problems of those states. Economic depression, high unemployment, massive inequality, did not restructure how wealth was accumulated, i.e. in Africa, mostly through the state, or break the stranglehold of a few small elites on state power. By the late 1990s, with few exceptions, democracy was viewed as an impediment to development. This consensus held more or less among both African elites in the state, ruling parties, and local business, as well as in the development industry. And I think this is crucial, and also among Western powers who kind of encourage this kind of politics. I would say it sort of starts with Bill Clinton. And there's an interview with Bill Gates from November last year with the editor of Vox.com, where Gates argued that people intent on helping the world's poor cannot afford to work exclusively with democratic countries. And I quote, "If you wait, usually you only get really good governance once a country is middle income." And he continued, "When you have a leader like Paul Kagame in Rwanda," and I'm going to get back to him in a minute, "who appoints good people and really cares about these results, it's a fantastic thing," unquote. He also added that Ethiopia ran since the end of dictatorship in 1994 by a one-party state. Both it and Rwanda neither checks every box of excellent government. This is Bill Gates speaking. It's likely that those countries, until they get to middle income status, won't have all those characteristics. It is important, Gates again, to separate out the economic model of development from that of the political model. The most important changes government can make are to adapt to market-based pricing and to invest in citizens by bolstering sectors like health and education. Any government could make these changes, even an authoritarian one. So it's worth saying more about the model presented by Paul Kagame, since Bill Gates praises this model so much. Kagame built a reputation for ending the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, which is also which is an interesting moment in the history of Africa, which is also the moment in which South Africa gets its freedom. Sort of a month later, there's a genocide in Rwanda. So he gets a reputation for ending that genocide as the head of the military movement that overthrows the government. He becomes a deputy president, and later the president from 2003 onwards, and so he's identified with overseeing the country's rebuilding effort. Just go back and read accounts of Kagame in The New Yorker, for example, or how glowingly Clinton, Bush, meaning George W. Bush, or say philanthropists like Howard Buffett, and of course Gates, talk about him. As a result, donor money flowed into Rwanda, and Rwanda has been praised for its development indicators. Visitors gush at the transformation of the urban scape of the capital, Kigali, and especially at its cleanliness. More recently, Rwanda's development successes have been questioned, and researchers have complained that the government manipulates the numbers, that poor Rwandans can't afford to live in the improved capital, Kigali, and that Kagame is basically a dictator. And I don't know if you sort of follow this kind of thing, but Kagame wins elections by like 99% of the vote. And in 2017, he changed the constitution. He sort of backdated like when he started governing to govern effectively until 2032. In the process of changing the constitution, they held a national listening session, and they went around the country, and they could only find 10 people that disagreed with him getting this to govern until 2032. And how do we sort of make sense of what Kagame is doing? Aziz Rana, who's a professor of law at Cornell University, has described or characterized this as electoral authoritarianism. Basically, with greater and greater sophistication, governments realize that they can use the security apparatus and resources of the state to shape the terms of any vote, and if needs be, to manipulate outcomes, especially around the edges. And for foreign officials primarily interested in the exercise on election day, this is largely enough to keep relations cordial and investments and security arrangements in place. In Kagame's case, this is combined with oppressing opposition, including murder and assassination. So on top of electoral authoritarianism, Kagame then combines this with what has been termed developmental patrimonialism by the political scientists David Booth and Frederick Guluba Mutebi. Essentially, what is meant by this developmental patrimonialism, it's like the economic policy, if you want, is the financial capital sustaining the rule of the RPF, which is the ruling party, is centralized and deployed through bodies such as party-owned enterprises, and is then allocated in a manner that is objectively developmental. So the government sets up like a private investment arm, and it basically invests that back into the economy, but at the same time, of course, the sort of higher ups in the party, they get rich, and they sort of redistribute the gains like through the leadership and sort of throughout the structures of the party. So there's definitely corruption involved, and the party's hierarchy enriches themselves, but it all appears above board, and there's an appearance of success as they reinvest in the local economy. And in fact, there are also visible signs of development in the country. It appeals to donors who favor metrics and want results. The trade-off, of course, is a lack of democracy and combined with repression. As long as there's development, democracy doesn't matter basically, and Kagame models himself on Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, who pioneered this governance model. Here's where it gets interesting when I was sort of saying about when we think about these kind of models. Kagame's model is very popular among various African constituencies. Among the young, longing for new models of politics that appears to be accountable, Kagame looks very attractive. This model that he has, this kind of electoral authoritarianism, but particularly the developmentalist patrimonialism. They defend him online. They vigorously come to his defense when people sort of, talk about the lack of democracy. By this logic, liberal democracy is a failure. It's just deliberation for deliberation's sake. Kagame's model shows results, and this is, as I said, there's especially a very vigorous debate about this online. Secondly, Africa's cosmopolitan middle classes also see in Rwanda a success story, efficient, clean. But it's also appealing to more traditional elites in the media. There are glowing reports of Kagame's government model on some African broadcasters and in most newspapers and on websites. These are both private and public media. Crucially, Kagame has also been feted outside the continent. Global Citizen, an international NGO that fights poverty by holding music concerts, have featured Kagame on its programs. Elite universities in the US have invited Kagame to speak at invited lectures. These include the Coca-Cola World Fund Lecture Series at Yale. Even more significant is that Kagame's model for Rwanda is getting a hearing among governments in Africa, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and crucially governments that are not more than just nominally democratic, such as South Africa. In the latter country, Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, which is associated with fighting undoing the corruption of his predecessor Jacob Zuma, has publicly expressed his admiration for Rwanda and Kagame, especially for the clean streets. So has the country's finance minister, Tito Mboweni. The latter's repeated tweets about how clean Rwanda is has earned him the nickname Mr. Kigali. Separately, the ruling ANC in its electoral campaign for the elections next month have organized campaigns, events mimicking Kagame's habit to lead cleanup campaigns once a week. So a combination of the ANC's failure to foster a communal sense of citizenship among its leadership and followers and people's frustration with the lack of change may explain this appeal. Finally, I want to make a quick note about the influence of evangelicals in African politics. One of the defining features, as a sort of part of this phenomenon of right-wing politics, one of the defining features of Trump's winning coalition is his alliance with evangelicals. Most polls show that evangelicals are steadfastly behind Trump. His endorsement of patriarchy and other social conservative courses have a lot to do with it. Some of these same groups, and this is where again I make the link to Africa, dating back to the early 1990s, have fanned out over the African continent, spreading this gospel of social conservatism, free market fundamentalism, and crucially, respect for authority and shunning politics. They found governments like Uganda's, in power since 1986, very receptive. Think of the general homophobia in Uganda. It can be traced to these movements. Satellite television, so again, these factors, they all sort of interact, which beam the sermons of evangelical preachers, also played a role. One consequence has been the growth of local versions of this kind of phenomenon. So it's not like people are just constantly listening to these American preachers, they've developed their own version. The local version, they outdo the American counterparts in denouncing minorities, gays, the way they talk about women, etc., and the role of women within society. Crucially, these local pastors have grown very powerful and influential and represent solid electoral blocks. In some cases, politicians court them for votes and for prophecies, usually confirming that the said politician is the preferred candidate. In other cases, politicians gleefully sign on as members of these churches. It's unclear whether the affection is genuine or vote buying. In any case, the general effect is that previously progressive governments like that in South Africa pull back from commitments to social reforms and other forms of equality. Jacob Zuma, Ramaphosa's predecessor in South Africa, became the poster boy for this kind of politics. Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's president, who was actually educated in this country, said last year that for the majority of Kenyans, gay rights was of no importance. Now, we don't have enough data yet on their influence, but a number of new studies anticipate their growing influence on local politics, from charismatic pastors in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria and Ghana, or the growing presence on the continent of the Brazilian Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, which I know has the ear of the Bolsonaro government, and I think they're beginning to get the hearing of governments in Africa. Let me see, I've got like a minute or so. Just by ending, I just want to just respond quickly to some of the problems that Paul sent around. First, I think and these are some of the questions that are printed on the flyer. Yes, political economic questions are at the heart of these kind of developments that we're seeing, and I could say more about this later. But I think I was talking about liberal democracy in the early 1990s and the transition to democracy in Africa. I think definitely this long program of structural adjustment, global debt, the failure of neoliberal reform. I mean, there are specific policies at a continental level through the African Union. They had this thing called the NEPAD, and then various countries had the local version. It's literally basically sort of neoliberal economic programs. It's people reacting to the failure of that, people's clamoring for some form of welfare state. At the same time, I think it's also interesting that recently in Ethiopia's transition from a sort of developmentalist state, the new leader in Ethiopia, it's still a one-party state, but he is very enthusiastically embracing free market capitalism. So it's interesting to see how those add up. And I just one other thing. In terms of how their relationship to democratic politics, I think it's mostly in the way that democracy works for them. If democracy works for you, then they are for democracy. And I can detail if you want later on maybe sort of how this plays out in some context. Yeah, one last point, and then I'll stop after this. There is that's the one. That's not what I should stop. But I just want to let me add this last point. So just two quick points. One is there is definitely politics of authenticity that is linked to this kind of politics. I mean, there's a number of cases where the presence of populations that became part of the nation through sort of colonial labor regimes, their authenticity of belonging to that place. So in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, there are people who came, say 2-3 generations ago from Burkina Faso, and so in this case, it was actually a historian who became the president, and he then constructed this whole notion of the nation of that these people don't belong. And then just finally, there is also now the other side of this, which is a kind of left populism, a sort of left authoritarian populism, which there is also a long history in Africa of this kind of politics, and the most vivid kind of the expression of it is in South Africa again, by this group called the Economic Freedom Front, which wears red berets, kind of models themselves on Chavez, it's sort of like the local version of Chavistas, but they combine it also with this kind of authenticity politics, xenophobia, and sort of the admiration of kind of the leader, the main leader, which is the worshiping of one particular sort of charismatic figure. Yeah. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank Philip Shaw for wonderful presentations. And yeah, let's open it up for questions, comments for our speakers. Yeah.
While Sean was talking, I was Googling around, and there's an absolutely surreal interview. Have you seen this with the Wall Street Journal with Kagame in the spring of 2017, just after Trump has been elected? And so the premise of this interview is that the globalist Wall Street Journal is interviewing its African hero of globalism, which is Kagame. And this goes merrily along as they talk about FDI, and then they ask him the question, what about the political regime at home? To which his response is, that question is you having become victims of the fake news apparatus, the consequences of which you are now seeing in your own country. Right, so we're like disappearing down a spiraling rabbit hole in which the notion of fake news can be used by what is essentially an African authoritarian regime to discredit totally sympathetic Wall Street Journal globalists, and then the conversation ends and we move on, right? But it's an incredible moment where, and the headline is Rwanda's president on Africa's fate in the age of populism, where the populism is American populism. So that was just it's an extraordinary neuralgic kind of symptom of how confused this conversation has become.
I mean, part of this, I don't know, I should respond, but part of it is there's also kind of a guilt complex in the West about Rwanda, which allows him to get away with that, because his argument is when the genocide happened, the West was sort of dithering and not doing any, Clinton was like unsure whether to call it a genocide or whether to intervene. And so he holds that's kind of what he's holding over them. And so if you criticize him, it's like, you can't criticize me. You didn't do anything about my genocide. So that's like his card, which is now more than 25 years old.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for two stimulating presentations. I was trying to think about like some of the themes that kind of come out, and I think across the presentation. So in the first presentation, there was the question of why do well-off countries still vote for right-wing populism? So by the way, I'm identifying myself as a non-lapsed political scientist, but cynical and self-loathing, so hopefully accessible. But the point that I thought was kind of interesting in this discussion, and that also dovetails with Sean's presentation, is a lot of this discussion focuses on what's happening with what we think of as either, depending on the context, if it's in the global South poor, if it's in the North working class communities. But one of the constants across a lot of this, and I think that's true historically as well, and that's definitely true in the cases that I study, is the importance of middle classes and even wealthy populations to these phenomena. And that we often misplace, so even going back to Trump, the discussion about anxiety misses the point that Trump doesn't win without wealthy people voting for him, and wins more of the vote among the wealthy than the poor. That's still true, right? And so the same is true with Modi in India, right? The consolidation of Modi in India was the consolidation of upper caste Hindu vote. And of course some outreach outside that, but he doesn't win without turning out the core, which was elites. Kagame, the idea of this middle class cosmopolitan backing, and that really feeds into these, so you were talking about the cleanliness of Kigali. The signature public policy campaign of the Modi government was Clean India, which, and a strong leader who's going to clean India, and guess who that plays well with, right? And so when we're examining this,
include the air.
Right. Well, unfortunately, you can't evict the air. Right? You can evict all other countries. And so,
toilets.
Toilets.
It was mainly about public defecation.
It was about public defecation, but again, very linked. That's the idea of cleanliness and caste, and whose role it was to remove public defecation. So what I'm saying is that in all of these phenomena, the strands we tend to kind of sometimes focus on in these discussions is like what's happening, often focuses kind of on a stream of people who have not been the bulwark of these movements, at least in many parts of the world, historically who's kept it alive, especially in the global South, have been urban middle classes, and you don't get anywhere without that. And so I just found that interesting across the two presentations by way of an observation. And the second was this idea, this question of this anthropologically kind of studying tension between, say, migrants and natives that came up in the first conversation. So I think that is something actually that there has been quite a bit of work on. And one of the things that's been interesting about that is that a lot of the work that I found interesting is that most of the migration in this world is happening within the global south. It's south-south migration. And most of it is internal migration within boundaries. And that hasn't prevented it from being used by these movements. And in fact, the kind of global push for decentralization has meant that the way in which politics can play out is at very local level. So the idea of who's native and who's migrant can be a very local concept, which permits a much wider range of migrations to fuel these forms of politics than the very macro level at which we tend to study, which I'm not trying to deny that those are not important.
Right.
But I think a lot of what's interesting is the way in which the kind of deification of decentralization as a kind of silver bullet for economic policies. And nowhere has that been kind of jammed through more than in poor countries under structural adjustment, etc. And one of the consequences that I think has been neglected, but that's been really important to what we're discussing today, is that native migrant, that conflict doesn't just exist at the level that we often think of it. It can be very local. It can be even village to village, given where the pots of money are and where politicians are trying to construct coalitions. So those are just two thoughts in reaction to the very interesting comments.
Thank you.
Same is true for Brexit as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Like the solid core of Tory Brexit voting is Shires. It's not the left behind post-industrial belt, though they add on.
Right, they're crucial.
But just on the point of kind of the management of the migration problem for Europe, like one of the sort of crucial facts of that debate is that the way in which, for example, North African countries are sort of they performing like the function of like an indirect ruler to manage migration. So the EU is pumping all this money into Sudan, Algeria, Egypt, so they performing the function of this European state, which is having this kind of debate about crisis in Europe, but the actual crisis being managed for them by these very authoritarian regimes. I mean, you know, like on that's the frontier of the crisis, yeah. And they doing that work. Yeah.
This is not so much a question, it's also sort of a comment, but I mean, I think one of the themes that will come up in a number of discussions is this theme of the persistence of elections within authoritarian regimes. And I would like to make an argument for Latin America as, and particularly Mexico, as a forerunner of this. And from the Mexican Revolution on, from the 1920s on, you in effect had a single party system that nonetheless had highly organized elections and actually did change presidents every 6 years. Even under the dictatorship in Brazil, you had regular elections. So, and one of the things to think about is what, some of that is legitimate, is an attempt to seem legitimate, to make, but I think it's more than that. And particularly because it's so transparently when you have 99%. So I think it would be interesting to talk about what other purposes this kind of authoritarian election system serves beyond just sort of a kind of facade of legitimacy on the international stage. I don't have an answer to that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, about the, who is supporting whom? Of course, Brexit and so on. Of course, you have, the parts of the elite.
Also and middle class.
And middle class, yeah. But I mean, Rees-Mogg and I think, you also have the old kind of pseudo-gentry. But still, I wonder, yes, middle class, that's certainly important. That's why I said, here's the lower middle class in these welfarist countries. Yes, but still, I think what was striking about recent election results is that indeed, a majority of workers, still being workers, voted for the right. Now that depends on the country, but that's what we have seen, in Austria and Italy. It's also true for Poland.
France as well. For the Front National.
Yes, and Front National. Well, Mélenchon, I don't know how much he gathered from them. Not much. Okay, so this is still, there, and that, course, leads me to yet another conclusion. You know, when we talk about populism, you know, that this is kind of following the tradition to talk about kind of the other, right? And, you know, among academics who perceive themselves as probably not populists, and, you know, and so isn't that the relative strengths, you know, strongly correlated to the relative weakness of what was once considered as the left? And then maybe we can talk about ourselves, or well, approach some of parts of ourselves. And I think that's why it is important, you know, to consider the lower middle class, the working class, you know, however we want to encircle it. It depends on the country. But okay, so the global south, it's more the middle class. Sure, it makes sense. Why is this discrepancy? That would be then my question. You know, why is it? You know, in the industrial country, I would say after all, it still is more kind of a lower middle class phenomenon, and why in, you know, in India, let's say more middle class phenomenon, or maybe even upper middle class. Can we explain this?
I mean, just
discrepancy. How could we explain it? You know, with a Marxist approach, a
I think
class-based
the worry I
approach,
have
or-
is that some of this may be just a definitional issue. That because this is such a capacious and maybe far too capacious as some of us in this room think is term, that this is just an artifact of different definitions. And that in some ways would be kind of interesting to just to pass out, but I don't know if that's, you know, then it's just kind of bad. It's like, you know, when what we're defining as populism, what we're defining as right wing, which is not a concept, left and right, and, you know, tax and transfer based dimensionalities of politics don't translate everywhere. So it's just about that and how we define either the middle class or populism or left and right. I think that's one direction of an answer, but the more interesting one for me would be, you know, are there kind of trends and of this that are actually comparable, that we miss, or that studying it in one area can actually tell us what we might be missing in another. And that is kind of what I'm interested in about, you know, I don't know, I don't study, you know, Western Europe as closely as many in the room, so that's the part I'm more interested in.
Yeah. Oh, I'm an interloper, so I apologize for the business school, but one of the things to play off of this, and something that's on my mind, is the problem of causality that you were wrestling with. In both cases, what I was listening to or trying to hear is attempt to understand change post a really fundamental disruption, right? 1989, or the collapse of apartheid. I'm wondering, upon those reflections, if there's a continuity of causality or a discontinuity of causality in that which led to those disruptions and that which has followed those disruptions, in terms of giving us an insight about how do we think about the underlying processes at work which are driving these changes in the problems in the room. Does that make sense as a...
You mean in terms of like whether there was a complete rupture, or whether the new system kind of...
As you understand the question of why apartheid fell, and then you look at what happened after, or if you understand why, ask the question why 1989, and then you look at after, is there a continuity of causality, or is there a discontinuity of...
Right, it's like, I'm not sure if I should, like, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but like, there are different, it depends on how, I'm just thinking of like the case for South Africa, for example, specifically. It's like, how would you explain the transition might help. So there's kind of one view, sort of leftist, kind of Marxist interpretation of the transition, which is apartheid becomes too costly, and the elites, both in the state, some elites in the state, but essentially the business elites make it clear to the apartheid state, you can't continue with this project because the black majority, you know, the opposition is not able to defeat the system. The system has guns, but the system can't continue, it becomes too costly. There's also, at that point, there's the end of the Cold War, that because the West is supporting apartheid, and the Soviet Union supports the liberation movement / opposition. So the result is is not perfect. It's like it's a negotiated. It's not really a revolution. It results in a kind of a negotiated settlement in which the new state has to retain the same civil servers, has to make sure that whites don't leave because of the experiences in neighboring Mozambique and Angola, where at the end of colonialism, whites destroyed the infrastructure or left, and so it's trying to construct a new society out of a set of compromises, and subject to like a series of kind of larger structural factors, and then trying to make a new society. And and then there's the projection that people are having on that. So the Black South African is thinking, this is going to be a completely new society, and they have all these demands on, and so I think that's where the problem comes. It's like, how to make sense of it is like, there's like what was possible, and there's what people think, what ordinary people thought was going to happen in the society. And so now, 25 years later, you have a generation of people, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, who have no memory of apartheid, like their only memory is of freedom. So they have no time for that, for people who have that longer view of the causality and like what is possible and so on. They just want them, they want this new system to deliver to them. And I think that's where some of the contradictions come in. I'm not sure if I answered it, but yeah.
I was very interested in earlier discussion that Philip began about the politics of authenticity and how this kind of came together with these populations in Eastern Europe of sort of young, mobile people who are leaving it behind a very certain kind of voter. And I wonder if you think that there's any traction to be got from this older analysis that Hirschman laid out of exit voice and loyalty. And the way I think about this is obviously the exit are the younger mobile people who are moving to the West from Poland to England, or however that works out. Or you could talk about them in terms of sort of mobile EU bureaucrats who don't have this sort of same connection to the place. Voice, especially with respect to the EU, and I think that while you can make an argument that populism has a longer history, at least in Germany, for example, it really came to the fore in the wake of the Greek debt crisis. And so, voice is what these people don't feel like they have in that context. And what is left? Left is loyalty, and sort of this rhetoric of authenticity or national loyalty appeals precisely to that within that framework.
Thanks for this comment. I will also come back to this, the cause of discontinuity or continuity. So I would agree, yes, that this emigration indeed changes the societies on a very profound level, and obviously also the politics. On a more anthropological level, I think what is really pivotal is also a very basic experience. Very often in these areas of out-migration, one of the parents, sometimes even two, go to work abroad and are seen, only on the weekends. Even worse in Ukraine, when you don't have free travel, maybe once a month, maybe once a year. And the other, also the kids are left behind, and this is not a good experience. I know it from ego documents, which were collected above all in Poland. So there's also this experience of disruption. Now, however, how that translates into then, the politics of authenticity, I would have to think about it. I think the main difference and why it is so strong is also because you have some people, being left behind, and they are confronted with new wealth, either in other parts of the country or even there where they live, for example, through remittances, this is the, so to say, the kind of affluent side of that. So I would say, an anthropological or emotional deprivation, which is probably all the more felt because of the material advance in parts of the society. So I think this can be, could be observed on a local level and a, let's say, a translocal level. And that creates tensions. I forgot unfortunately where it was published. There was this study about, riots in airplanes. And it seems to be like 3-4 times more frequent if you have a business class in that plane. It makes people aggressive to walk by that business class and then having to be crunched into the narrow seating.
That's why they split them at the end.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
Now, I forgot, unfortunately, this first class phenomenon, but when I read it, of course, it's a populist message in there, but it made sense to me. Now, about the continuity and the discontinuity. And again, what is populist? I mean, of course, there was populism around before '89. If you look at the Solidarność platform in '81 in Poland, this was, in a way, a left-wing populism directed against the communist government. A kind of, you can say, primordial socialist, Leninist to a degree, of course also Catholic. But anyway, this was populism, that there must be more of the Mehrwert, of the added value for the working class. Now this populism, however, was based on, I would say, absolute levels of poverty. Okay, and lack of consumption goods. I mean, very basic ones. Meat, at least for the Sunday meat dish. Now, there's a continuity of agents. Okay, these left-wing unionists. So the true, if you want, left-wingers in the communist country. Then they became left-wingers after '89. They got very frustrated also because of privatizations and the disregard and the reforms, and then they moved to the right. So here you have a continuity of populism, which then, left, right, here, right are the adults, but okay, still it's helpful to understand from where these people started and to where they moved. So here I would say there's a continuity of agents. Whether that's a continuity of causality, I'm not so sure. But anyway, to talk about the causality question. So absolute poverty is certainly overcome. Okay, there's Polska B, but there's also in these post-communist countries part of the society. They profit, and so there is only partial poverty left. But of course, also more social inequality on absolute levels, and that can be measured, by the way. And I think so there is a gain, a material gain, but that can create envy, greed, and however also expectations of more advance in various parts of the society, but also fears to lose it. So how does that translate into a causality? At least I would give an answer to, which might be too indirect to be convincing, but this times of absolute poverty and the populism then, I think that can still be understood fairly well with a traditional, let's say, Marxist analysis. With material levels and conflicts and interest. What we see now, I think one needs a new mode of trying to explain all this. And you need more of a revisionist or, more anthropologically based do we always need Marxism? I don't know, but Polanyi is, right? And so, one would move on in order to explain this well. And maybe also to understand why the workers, the lower middle class, have these preferences. So, okay, a continuity and attempts how to explain this with a degree of discontinuity. That would be my very twisted answer. On how to analyze this more than on,
I would like to ask you to take up the theme that Paul raised at the beginning about the way you're thinking about how you're defining populism, because you're using it across a whole bunch of different movements, including what you just ended with, which is like working classes trying to enfranchise themselves or getting more out of the state. Is that it? I mean, because that seems to be really capacious and covering a whole broad brushstroke. So what is populism as you're thinking about it? Because you're using it a lot and you're implicitly sort of have an understanding of it, but I'm not clear about what it actually means. And is it always linked to nationalism? I wasn't clear on your debate, or has it become nationalism? I mean, I'm sure, what do you mean by it?
I would say
this
this
gets back to this question about how useful is that terminology
Yes.
to cover this phenomena across multiple places that we're talking about, and yeah.
I'm not sure in the long term. I mean, at the moment we are discussing it because it's all up on the table, and it's all up, the rise of populism everywhere. And if indeed, one day we might come up with the conclusion that, there's such a large amount of differences in our attempts to explain the rise of a phenomenon, if there's two different causalities, one day one might opt to drop the term, right? Or let's say, or to create hyphenated terms, I don't know. But this is an open question, and I'm not sure about it. Now, I would not consider myself being a historian of populism, by the way.
Did you just write a book on it?
No.
Something, I don't know.
No, the Europe after '89. It's a book about economic reforms from above and social results, so social history from below, plus some anthropological ingredients. And it comes in there, but it's one of the many results, but not the most important one. I'm more interested in the social, societal changes than in that book. Now, however, how to define it? Well, I mean, nationalism, that's what I would like to stress, is always a key ingredient in the sense of the distinction between in and out groups, us versus them, in a very confrontational way. And that's why I'm thinking that, this is important for a deeper understanding. Well, and then how to define it? I tried to define it, but obviously it did not convince you. Through these, protectionist promises on these four levels: international trade, labor market, so internal liberalization or the illiberal move against it. Well, law and order, tough against crime and internal safety, and the national value issue. So that's where the nationalism, of course, comes in again on a different level. That's, I think, which are key ingredients. This bunch of protectionist promises. But I'm not sure, how sufficient it is, and I have doubts. I mean, that there would be other doubts, isn't it? If we are here with if you are American, if you work on American history or Latin American, I mean, there's a completely other history of populism. So, if we call, and then there's yet another consideration, which is, of course, if we call them populist, aren't we doing them a favor in many ways? Which they're taking up, and they can say, yes, we are. Of course, we listen to the people. And what they ethnically define as the people. Of course, that's, I think, another sound definition of, political scientists. The commonality, another commonality is, of course, the ethnic reconstruction of the people with the claim to authenticity, the true people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's also a commonality.
Source of the term populism.
But anyway, so I think it's good that we are discussing it as historians.
So
How
that-
we
I mean, I
can
think that's
contribute to
a-
the debate is
yeah.
then another
No, that's a
question.
great, but I think it's a great point to raise about whether one is doing them a favor or not, or what it elides and what it reinforces. So, in some ways, I think that the way you define it makes a lot of sense in terms of what is being offered. But, you know, in terms of the question that was raised before about who's invested or who is manipulating or who are some of the interests that are engaged in that politics, it emphasizes those from below, right? So those who are aggrieved, those who are, you know, sort of those folks who are out, whose claims are being met by the people from below. But it doesn't emphasize all of those who are the insiders that are kind of part of this new form of politics. That's my one thing about the notion of populism, which I think it kind of elides the extent to which there are powerful elite groups and middle classes that are embracing this form of politics as well. And I just think we need to be careful. and really-
Sure, the Asians.
You mean in terms of like manufacturing it, or?
Manufacturing it, yes, but accommodating to it, maybe, benefiting from it, finding a way to, a form of instrumentalizing it, which one sees, I think, very much in the US case. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's not useful, but I think one has to be careful and sort of not reinforcing the idea that it's sort of just coming from below, you know, that there's a set of, right, that's sort of, and with Modi, I think it's a great example, because you've got these incredibly powerful elite groups that are at the core of this nationalist Hinduism, right, which is, you know, the meeting sort of sets of grievances, but just that dynamic of above below, I think is really, really important.
I mean, just in response, I was thinking through this, and I was thinking that maybe we're referring to, in my field, there are at least 3 different ways in which the term gets used, and maybe what's useful is like adding which way we mean it, because there are populist parties or politicians, and that really refers to who it is. So usually it's referred to somebody who's traditionally an outsider, so not somebody who's in the mainstream party, an existing party, and somebody who uses plebiscitarian tactics to have a direct, unmediated link to voters, not through party organizations. That's how it's used in an organizational sense. So lots of the people we're talking about wouldn't fit that bill. If they're coming up through mainstream parties, if they were traditional insiders, so Kagame has a history, like he's not an outsider when he comes up. And then there are populist strategies, which often is just, you know, the term that got used in one of the presentations was, you know, strategies to cynically win majorities. Like, as a political scientist, I think that's all about, like, so I don't know that that's a particularly useful term, but it may be, but in which case, what does that mean? What makes it cynical to win a majority as opposed to a pure way of winning a majority? I'm not sure. or a strategy that doesn't use in-groups and out-groups. To me, I think that's a very difficult distinction, but I'm willing to listen. But the idea of populist strategies often has what distinguishes left and right and that kind of technique. And then the third one is who supports it. Right, so the idea is who is it targeting? Is it targeting a particular sliver, and that defines and that's the one that I have some problem with. It we define something as populist if it's somehow targeting lower income groups or poor groups, and in a way, to me, I'm not, you know, but I think there are kind of middle class populism. So at least in terms of support, if you define it in these other ways, and so. You know, there's strategies, there's who supports, and there's the kind of parties and the nature of the parties or politicians. Those are 3 different ways, and maybe we can specify when we're talking about it. I don't know if that's helpful.
We do have to add, at least make a nod to Jan, right? So there's at least a 4th mode, which would be in terms of rhetorics of them versus us.
Yeah.
Rhetoric of totality, the identification of an elite that is counterposed. I mean, I like those 3, but I think
that's fair.
I'm not surprised that a discipline that can't deal with the idea of bad faith also is going to exclude the ideological entirely. The difference between a cynic and an ideologist is the difference between somebody who believes the ideology and somebody who is viewing it entirely manipulatively. And certainly from the point of view of a historical discipline devoted to the principle of understanding, that's got to be a meaningful distinction. So, because otherwise, our accounted actors are not. Anyway, but I think that will be the 4th category to want. I mean, then we would indeed have some kind of a grid. Whether anything useful emerges from that is another question, but I think it is capable of definition in those terms.
Right, I think the most useful actually is the ideological or linguistic, right? The claims to simply sort of the notion of the virtuous people and the above and below. And that what comes underneath that is obviously incredibly thin, very, very different. So I think that's,
I mean, that is probably the aspect of populism that is kind of trans-historical, because otherwise talking about populism without historicizing it is really pointless. And for a long time, what social scientists meant by populism was the movement typified by Juan Perón in Argentina. And that was a very specific kind of populism that emerged at a specific time with a particular social base. And that was all that populism was when people talked. Before that, it was agrarian populism in Russia and the United States. And so I think that the term means a particular kind of politician, a particular kind of movement at a particular historical time. But the one thing that I think is present in all these movements is precisely the sort of them, us, rhetoric.
Don't we want, maybe that makes a fifth category in the sense that we have to recognise populism as precisely a term, it's a contested, I mean, it's a Brandon Williams like contested term, right? It's a term of abuse, it's an asymmetric term to a large extent, and it belongs in a history of conversations about liberalism to others. Or,
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
it is
The only
constantly
group that's never populist is this kind of third way empty politics.
Yeah.
Like everybody else is populist. That I find that interesting. Like
Except that you can pull
Yeah.
the stunt, right, of claiming that Obama was a populist, that Tony Blair was evidently a
Right.
populist from the point of view of a solidly based social democracy, let alone Marxism. They clearly. So in any case, it's this floating term that.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank our first two presenters for really getting us off to a great start and for all your questions. I think we've started off with a nice sort of energized first panel. So why don't we take about a 15-minute break, walk around, get coffee if you'd like, and we'll resume with our second panel.
let's see.